welcome everyone to our fourth Sunday afternoon speaker series. We're so glad to have you. And welcome all the Zoom people as well. Happy to have you too. It's with great appreciation that we, the residents of Protection Island, acknowledge this land as the unceded territory of the Nanaimo First Nation and of their legacy throughout the island. Thank yous go to Liz Hammond Karima for providing transportation for her friend and our guest speaker, Tim Goder, and his wife, Marianne, right here. Hi, Marianne. Some of you will also know that Tim shares his office at VIU with Jane Watson, who was our speaker a couple of weeks ago. And so he has definite connections with PI, and we like that. Peter, thank you for chairs and setup and coffee making, even though we were a bit late. Emily, thank you for Zoom setup and recording. Thank you. And also, we have no guides this week.
Just one, Renee.
She is. Okay. So help serve if you need any help serving. Donations this week, we are going to go to the who was that now? The
Silly Boat Regatta.
Silly Boat Regatta. That's right. We had changed it just at the last minute. The guides are, as you know, are going to camp on Davis Island at the end of April, and apparently they're doing financially okay. So we're changing it to the Silly Boat Regatta. Housekeeping. The talk is being recorded. If anyone needs to see it again, there's just one washroom. Peter has not told us what's in the other washroom, and we're not going there. So there's just one available. Questions will be at the end of the talk for everyone. Zoomers, use the chat box or raise your hand. And please mute yourself until the completion of the talk. And now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Tim Goder, and his topic, Parasites, ... Ecological Superstars. Now I'm just going to read a little tiny bit about them. Parasites often have had a bad reputation as potential causes of parasitic diseases. This is not surprising. However, they are also fascinating animals with spectacular adaptations and intricate life cycles. They also have important ecological and evolutionary impacts in nature. This talk explores the diversity of parasites and the ecological roles they can play. A bit about Tim now. Tim was born in Moose Factory, Ontario. Oh, does anyone know where that is? On the south end of King Bay. And he was raised mostly in North Carolina. He achieved his Bachelor of Science in Zoology at Brandon University, his MSc and PhD in Ecological Parasitology at Wake Forest in North Carolina. For 31 years, Tim was a professor in the biology department at Malaspine VIU. And he tells me his greatest career satisfaction has been to engage and inspire his students with a passion for the importance of invertebrate animals, especially parasites. Tim is also a writer, and he and his brother co-wrote the book Parasitism, the Diversity and Ecology of Animal Parasites. Tim was awarded the VIU Provost Award for Excellence in Teaching in 2015. And a Distinguished Alumni Award from Brandon University with his brother in 2021. On a retirement, he was awarded VIU's Emeritus designation. Tim is married to Marianne. They're known as the Professor and Marianne. They have two children, both in university now. Highlight they shared as a family was a trip to the rainforest in Ecuador and the Galapagos Islands in 2019. So we can ask things about that too. Please welcome Tim Goder.
Thank you, everybody. It's a great location to be able to come and give a talk on my favorite animals, the world of parasites. I kind of feel like a Protection Islander all these years. It was mentioned it was 31 years at VIU. Well, 31 of those years with Liz, Jane, Graham, Mo, Trudy. And so whenever I'm over here, it's like, I'm home again. And so it's always great to be here. So what I want to give you an idea of today before you end up leaving is I want you to be able to tell people why they're considered ecological superstars. So by the end of my talk, you're not going to say that parasites are yucky. You're gonna say that, yeah, they might be yucky in some ways, but they're also really important organisms out there in nature. And if I convince you of that, you'll also find out that they're a pretty fascinating group of animals. And I have a little quiz at the end, and we'll see how you do. It's easy. And so I thought a talk like this, you better kind of know what a parasite is. And you might have an idea what one is, but we should really get a good definition of one so that we know exactly what we're talking about as we move along. But basically, for the sake of my talk, it's any animal living in or on another living animal. And that there's so much biology to that simple statement, because you got to find your way in or on that animal, and then you got to find a way out of it to infect a new host. And not only that, your host is designed to kill you by virtue of the immune system. So it poses all kinds of questions that I think are pretty interesting, and I hope I convince you. But basically, what you're going to see as the talk rolls along is that how do we recognize a parasite as a parasite? Well, often they're going to have this incredibly morphological or structural adaptation to hold on, whether it's on the host or inside the host, to prevent it from passing into feces. Okay, and so watch for those morphological adaptations to attach to a host. That's one way we can recognize that huge assortment of things we call parasites. Well, what also makes them super unique and interesting is that they can't do without their host. They use that host to feed on and also reproduce. And that is very different from the vast majority of critters you're more familiar with. So basically, when we talk about them in lecture, we talk about them being physiologically or metabolically dependent on their host. They need that host to survive. What makes them a parasite different from other symbiotic organisms that also live in or on a host potentially is that they cause some degree of harm. And that is the essence of being a parasitologist, really, often is that last statement. We know so much about the world of parasites because they harm us or our pets or our livestock. They cause some degree of harm. Sometimes it's a lot of harm. Lots of times they're not that harmful. But given that, why can they be considered superstars, you're asking? You're going to pay attention to that coming up. And so when you see critters like this, you're saying, oh, the yuck factor. No doubt about it. That's a bat, by the way. And you probably never knew that they have an assortment of ectoparasites. They have these wicked appendages that hold on to that bat for dear life. And you can see that that is a fly, believe it or not. They're called bat flies. And so they're a group you've never seen before, and yet they're doing these invisibly important things out there in nature. You should be inspired to think, how does that critter get its critters, babies, on bats? And so it poses lots of questions, even though it might have the yuck factor. Imagine that hanging on to you. Yeah, and so you get the idea of the world of, for example, living on a host. Ectoparasites are pretty cool, maybe nasty in some ways. And then the endoparasites include a group you're at least a little bit familiar with, tapeworms or cestodes. And they're going to have this wicked morphological adaptation to hold on. And so this is actually one from sharks. It happens to be one of my favorite ones to show everybody. When we say they have exquisite, intricate morphological adaptations, we kind of mean it. Very spectacular in many cases. And for parasitology types like me, you can use those to help identify the endoparasites that might be in that host. Okay, and so there's two of my favorite examples. They, wow, for one. And for the other is just to remember, oh yeah, you're a parasite because you're totally dependent on that host to survive and reproduce. And often you have some type of morphological adaptation that makes you a parasite. Yeah, but also you don't want that if you're a bat. And so it causes some degree of harm. They might just hang on, but they're also a nuisance and potentially blood-sucking, etc. And so you get the idea of this some degree of harm business. Yeah. So why are they important? Well, did you know this? A little bit about the world of parasitism, the world of parasites. Did you know it's the most common lifestyle in nature? By far. Well over 50% of the world's organisms, plant and animal, can be considered as parasites. So there's a thing to remember. Maybe not for the quiz, but you get the idea. What's the most common lifestyle in nature? The world of parasites. Now, why they're so famous in terms of why people study them is this statement. They're the causative agents of many human parasitic diseases, veterinary parasitic diseases, the reason you take your dog to the vet, your cat to the vet, the horse to the vet, etc. Wildlife out there in nature, they can be the causative agent of disease. And you probably know fisheries parasitologists over at the biological station. They spend their lives studying fish parasites because of the disease component. Okay, and so you get the idea, the importance of parasites. If you really want to understand planetary or global diversity, you better know a little bit about parasites. And the second feature is that many of them can cause harm, such that they cause disease to animals we care about. Yeah? But given all of that, what I find the most interesting, the parasite disease part is fun and interesting to tell students about. And you're my students here now, so we'll talk about a few of them in a minute, but you get the idea that they may be invisible. You don't see them doing their things out there in nature, but they're doing these vital ecological things that I really want to focus on. And so there are these natural players in all ecosystems, and within marine, freshwater, terrestrial ecosystems, these invisible little guys are playing some very vital ecological roles, some of which I wanted to show you today. Can't do them all, but now you're getting at the idea of why are parasites interesting? Yes, they have all these cool morphological adaptations. They can cause some significant diseases, but also that they're superstars in what they can do out there in nature. Right? And so when I give this lecture to my students, and it's a subject of 3 or 4 lectures to convince my students that these things can be considered ecological and also evolutionary superstars. But I want to give you just a small dose of that today and see if I can convince you. And if that doesn't convince you, then I will convince you that they are a fascinating group. I can pretty much guarantee that. And so when you think of parasites, it's just an overview of just a few of them. So that when you leave, you'll say, oh yeah, malaria. There's an example of a disease of humans that almost everybody's heard about and you can relate to. It lives in a funny place. It's a unicellular small critter that spends a good chunk of its life within red blood cells. And that's probably something that you've heard about. And so one of the things that this disease is so famous for is because it's the #1 parasitic disease that kills people. It is a major parasitic disease of Africa. And so there's an example of a disease that affects humans. And you've heard about it. Anybody who's been to the tropics has taken anti-malarial drugs to prevent getting an infection. And oh, my fact about them is they're finally, after several, listen to this, $1 billion now, there's finally a vaccine. And it's not totally efficacious. It doesn't work all the time, but it still protects 50% of kids, which is a lot. And so when you think about a disease, finally, after all the money that's been spent on drugs and potential or vaccines, is a very promising one. And one of the other things I mentioned to my students, especially those that are interested in immunology, is guess what? All that money that went into the COVID vaccine, the mRNA vaccine that we've had, guess what? It's now got potential for developing such a vaccine for malaria now. So it's kind of a cool way of thinking about COVID, basically, that maybe it's going to help control even more a parasitic disease of humans. Here's one that you might have heard about. This is one, you might know that guy. Cute. They're cute, but you don't want them. This is beaver fever. Those little protozoans are the ones that cause beaver fever. Another human disease, in fact, the most common human parasitic disease of humans. It lives in a very different place. Instead of the red blood cells, it lives in our intestines, where it can cause, as you've heard, the wilderness trots. And so that's another example of a parasitic disease of humans. Here's one that's referred to as a keystone parasite, because it has a huge effect on a keystone species, honeybees. And I know you guys have heard a little bit about the plight of the honeybee. This is a juvenile honeybee before it leaves the colony, and it is nailed by two ectoparasites. There's your other new word, remember? We call varroa. Anybody remember the name varroa mite? So now you know it. Varroa mites are why we are so worried about our honeybees. Not only themselves causing problems, sucking blood from the developing honeybees, but they also transmit disease. They transmit viruses to the honeybee, and then your honeybee colony declines. And you've heard about the plight of the honeybee. Yeah, that affects pollination, all because of a mite. Ecological superstars. Yeah, getting a hint. There's one potential for causing mortality of the host it infects. And so that's a really nasty one. You'll read about it more and more in the papers. But again, it's not directly a human one, is it? Compared to these two. It's indirectly human because of its effect on a major, huge pollinator. So bottom line, human, in this case, insect. And now this kind of a nasty photo is a dog's heart. Yeah, and it is, again, a parasite you might have heard about. It's called heartworm. The nematode, in this case, Cocker Spaniel, was killed by that because of the sheer numbers of worms. So yes, parasites can be agents of disease, human, insects, and other wildlife, for example, and they can be this veterinary parasite disease as well. Yeah. So there's just an idea, or montage, if you will, of just to give an idea, why are parasites important? They're agents of parasitic disease of a whole diversity of different hosts. I'm going to come back to that right at the end again, too. So whenever I give a talk like this, I often get a talk at the end. So Tim, what is your most favorite parasites of all time? I have a real tough time. They're all my favorites. But this is certainly one of them. And you guys are going to leave, promise, and tell people about this parasite. This is my hand. We're in Belize, and that is one of the snappers there. And only that snapper species has this particular ectoparasite. The common name of the parasite is the tongue-eating isopod. Everybody got that? So, are parasites cool? Tongue-eating isopod. So, when that fish was younger, it had a larva going through the gills and ending up on the fish's tongue, eating the tongue. Yeah. And then the fish uses it as its tongue for the rest of its life. And so, why is that one of my favorite parasites? Do I need to say more? Imagine holding it in your hand in Belize, and then being able to take it off the tongue, what was left of the tongue, and holding it in your hand. So I'm very lucky, of course, then sneaking it home and having a vial, and then sharing it with my students. And so it gives you an idea that parasites come in all these multiple different kinds. There's one of my favorites, and now it's one of your favorites. Tongue-eating, Google it. And you will get all kinds of pictures, right? Quite as good as that one maybe, but pretty good. My buddy Eric Demers with his special camera took that photo while we were down there. Here's another one. And right away you're going to say, oh, Tim, you must have cheated and made this photo. Those can't have come from that fish. They did. This is a tapeworm. You can tell by the segments that it has. This is really the wow factor. You guys know a little bit about sticklebacks, I think. Small little fish you would have in the lake over on Protection in Newcastle, the ponds. But it has this gigantic, disgusting tapeworm minute. And by the end, this maybe will become a quiz. Why does it get so big? And what does it do to that poor fish? Imagine if you had more than two. Could you imagine it getting bloated? Can you imagine going belly up with these big, huge white doodads in you? Yeah. And the other hint is that they are larvae. One of the most well-known systems in parasite ecology is this one. How common is it in nature? What does it do to its host? Multiple different things. And what is its life cycle? Where does it, if this is the larva, where does it want to go next? And this is really going to be a concept I want you guys to get a feel for as the talk goes on. This fish, to get that parasite to get into and complete the life cycle, has to get into a fish-eating bird. Around here, it's loons, cormorants, and blue herons. So when you think about that, gang, you're getting at another superstar function. And we're going to pay attention to that one because another superstar function might be the presence of those worms actually indicates pretty intact food webs. Yeah, because you got to have birds present for that life cycle to continue. Okay, and that's just one part of things. So we're going to pay attention to that. But why the wow factor? Did you say wow? Yeah, well, most students do because they're so large. And how does the parasite survive in that tiny host to be able to get to the next host in the life cycle? And so there's all kinds of questions that are addressed with that little fish species. And if you know, some of you know a lot about sticklebacks, they're featured in evolution, behavior, throughout the world of animal biology, and especially now parasites. We're going to come back to this in a video in a minute, but you get the idea. That's not a normal snail. It's got these striped bags where their tentacles used to be. This is on the cover of our textbook. It's such a famous example of a parasite that has modified the appearance of the snail to make it more likely to be eaten by the next host. Wow, again, right? Parasites can actually modify the appearance of its host to make it more likely to get through these complex life cycles. Yeah, and say if you don't believe me, that's why we have video. You can always rely on my course and Jane's courses on David Attenborough. Watch for it. You ready, Liz? Certainly one of my favorite photos. My good friend, former student Devin, did a parasite study on this one here. And I show this slide also because most protection islanders know what Shiner perch are all about. They've seen them swimming around by the ferry dock, I'm sure. But you probably didn't know they have this gigantic critter on their gills. And it goes by the name of hemobathus. Say you want a higher detail. It doesn't even look like much. What the heck is that thing? It doesn't have legs. It does have egg sacs. That's what those are. And it's got this funny red, and by the way, it pulsates. It pulsates. Liz, you remember that pulsating? And we've done so much work on these guys. And what is the effect on the host? What is the biology of the parasite? How does that work? But let me tell you one cool story about them. They actually have this long holdfast that goes all the way into the fish's heart. Yeah. So not only does it have egg sacs, kind of like a sea louse. You guys have seen sea lice on your salmon. Well, this is a relative of one. It's a parasitic copepod that lives associated with Shiner perch and only Shiner perch. And so there's more of the wow factor. And I show this one because several of my students have, like I said, have worked on it. So imagine having a holdfast that goes all the way into the fish's heart. And by the way, that pulsating is due to the fish's heart. Every time the fish's heart pumps, it pumps. Again, it's a parasite that's so bizarre. No wonder I like it so much. We like it so much that when we go to Banfield, we have a little song. And it goes something like this. Hey, Bo Baffy. Hey, very good, Liz. Liz has been on many field trips with Jane and I to Banfield, and she's learned to love my buddy too. Very good. The song goes on, but you get the idea. So there's a couple other concepts that are vital for you to get. So you got an idea, parasites as agents of disease, morphologically adapted, the wow factor. But these two expressions are the essence of parasites. Why do I emphasize that? It's because of this. Yeah, and so we don't have a bunch of different parasites. Why? Because parasites exhibit host specificity. Only certain hosts will do. And even as you gathered from some of my slides, even on or in a host, only sites will do. And so it shouldn't be too much of a stretch when you say, how do they find their host? And then once they're in or on that host, how do they find the specific site? The tongue. Like the gills, the certain parts of the intestine. How do they find their host and their certain sites? And while I love, that seems simple, right? Well, just go find a host and get on the right site and you're done. But this is why parasitology is so fun and so multidisciplinary. It is my most fun aspect of being a parasitologist is you got to kind of master the behavior of your host and your parasite. You got to know genetics and immunology of your host and a whole variety of different ecological and evolutionary processes just to determine which host they get on or in. Wow. So a whole bunch of other biological fields comes into play to really understand parasites. And I'm going to talk about a few of them as we move along, but just remember, a parasite is adapted to only certain hosts. We don't have amphibian parasites coursing through us. We have certain mammal parasites in certain regions of the world. Why is that? It's going to reflect those big five things. So we've now found a host. Well, parasites are incredibly site specific. And you can imagine that, like in the case of a tapeworm, it's only a part of the small intestine that it lives in. It's got the whole small intestine. Why are they only found in a certain part of the small intestine? It's going to reflect, yeah, parasites exhibit behavior. They move in response to gradients. Yeah, you don't think about them, you don't see them like a bird or a mammal, but they do. They exhibit behavior to find their correct site. And then a whole variety of physiological cues can really settle them on that site. So that example of my tongue-eating isopod, why only that fish? The vast majority on the reefs of Belize, there's 200 species of fish. It's only that fish. Why the tongue? Yeah, so you guys will remember a bunch of things. Determine whether a host and parasite relationship forms. My favorite example, I've got a bunch of favorites, is I always tell my students, you guys need to do this too, is you always think like the parasite. Seriously, if you always think about how that parasite gets in, then you have at least a grasp of, okay, you know where it's going to end up. How does it get there? And you think, oh, beaver fever. Why are only mammals infected? They're host specific to mammals. Yeah. Well, how do they find themselves only in the small intestine? Think like the parasite. Think like the parasite for our quiz coming up. So here's another of my favorite examples. What is it? Morphologically, unbelievably bizarre copepod. It is another copepod like the guy in the gills and sea lice, but so highly modified. And so my point is stressing host and site specificity. Phrixocephalus is probably the best example I can give you. Imagine being, there's halibut out there, there's various types of sole, various types of flounder, and only the arrowtooth flounder works for this parasite. So not only in the vastness of the ocean that you have the guys being able to find the right fish host, but then they always pick the right eye. Not the left eye, always the right eye. Now, if there happens to be a couple other buddies in there, they might take the left eye. But now who can, what? First of all, let me know why the eye? Funny home for a parasite. But do you know anything about the biology of our eyes or fish eyes, that why parasites might evolve to fit there? There's not much of an immune system in our eyes. It's what we refer to in immunology as an immunoprivileged site. It's a great home because their immune system isn't going crazy fighting it off, especially something big. And also, why the right eye and not the left eye? Because fish goes blind, and if you have both, if your fish is blind in both eyes, that's not going to be a very successful fish. Yeah, host and site specificity. How does it find that host? And what's the answer? A variety of behavioral and ecological conditions out there in nature are going to at least put maybe the larva of this guy in proximity to the right fish. And then the eye. Amazing. Here's a parasite I've spent, well, my whole life studying, basically. And that topic says fundamental problems faced by parasites. Everybody watching and listening now, because this is going to be vital for our quiz. So the fundamental problem, all parasites, whether it's Giardia, malaria, or this parasite right here, that lives only in this frog's mouth. Why only this frog again? Behavioral and ecological and evolutionary factor. Oh, you guys are good. But it's called a fluke. And that'll be the focus of my talks today, because flukes are among my favorites. But it is a type of fluke that lives associated with that frog. And it just basically gets you the idea of, okay, how does it get there? How does it stay there? And then get out. And so what I always tell my students, and they always remember, just like my students on Protection Island, you have to have ways of getting in or on the host. That makes sense? Whether it's Phrixocephalus or whether it's my guy here. So how does that frog get that parasite? And only that frog, despite all the other frogs that might be in that ecosystem. So always remember. And it seems simple, doesn't it? Oh, just get in. But no, it's behavior, ecology, genetics, and a whole bunch of factors determine that one thing. So who can tell me what the next bullet is? Once you're in, what do you want to do?
Dad.
Stay in. Don't touch. Yeah. And here there is so much biology associated with staying in the host or on, depending on the parasite. Yeah. You got to cope with the host immune system. You got to feed. You got to reproduce. And you got to attach. So think about all those things in a parasite, and you have a wet mechanism of a whole bunch of what we call adaptations, enabling that parasite to stay in the host. If I took that guy out, you'd see this big, huge sucker. And they use that as their attachment structure in a pretty, tough place to be, with all that food coming down and the animal still is able to stay inside. What's the third one? Get in, stay in, and get your butt out of there to infect new hosts. If you can master those three things, you know so much parasitology, it's crazy. Those are the three fundamental problems or fundamental adaptations that all parasites face. Whether it's parasitic diseases of humans, or whether it's my little frog guy that has this parasite. So why I spent so much of my life studying this parasite, you can probably imagine a few things why this is a great model system in parasite ecology. You don't need to kill the host to get at the parasite. All you have to do is still a lot to do, right? You open up the frog's mouth and you can actually see and monitor that frog over time to see how many parasites are recruited and how many are lost. And how many other parasites can you do that? Not very many. It was complicated, but we did it. And the other thing that if you're really going to try to figure out how to get in a host, you better know the life cycle. Yeah. You gotta know what is the mechanism by which the parasite is getting inside that frog. Well, at the time it wasn't known. So that was one of the things that I worked out while I was at Wake Forest for my degree. So I like this example because it really, it's a parasite you're not familiar with. How do you get in? And the answer is incredible complexity. And that's going to be the basis for the rest of my talk. If this is the frog, all trematodes or flukes, like my previous slide, have these incredibly, amazingly complex life cycles. To get back into that frog, you got to go through snails. You got to go through these little microscopic critters we call copepods or ostracods, little shrimp-like guys. And that was what was known about the life cycle before I got my hands in there. They knew that crustaceans were involved, these little shrimpy guys. They knew that snails were involved because all flukes use snails. But they didn't know the rest of it. The one thing I knew as kind of an amphibian expert was that they didn't go dive bombing for these little tiny microscopic little guys. And so I predicted or hypothesized that maybe these little copepods, these little shrimp guys, are being eaten by nymphs, by dragonfly nymphs. And then the life cycle is still not complete because, again, frogs don't go underwater to feed. They feed on primarily flying insects. So the dragonfly has to survive the metamorphosis along with the parasite. And then it's available. And so right away, you're saying a single parasite uses 1, 2, 3, 4 hosts to get transmitted. Yep. And it should boggle your mind, right? You talk about showing how parasites have stuck themselves into a host food web. No kidding. Yeah, and I always get my students to think, why not just hatch from an egg and get back into the frog? Right? What a pain. Yes, it makes sense to produce all kinds of babies to get through these life cycles, but why not just have some of those eggs go right back into the frog? What are the advantages in terms of evolution of why these complex 1, 2, 3, 4 hosts? And the answer is one you can kind of think about. Is that what are the advantages in a life cycle that's in a pond to get into a flying insect? You get yourself spread more so than if you were a snail on land. No. Yeah, and so these complex life cycles represent a paradox. It seems it's a lot of pain in the butt to get through it, and yet they do. And if you happen to get into those, you have a way into a new pond. Watch for and a couple other examples. And so I spent a lot of my time studying what exactly were the hosts, what exactly were the dragonflies, etc. What are the different hosts in the life cycle to get through it? Yeah. So it's one of my favorite ones. Just stress to you, parasite you've never seen before, and yet they're fascinating. Here's one just briefly I want to give you a handle on, and it's one that is very big in the literature. Huge nowadays, especially in the ecology literature. That is not a normal frog. This frog species is the one day soon we're going to be hearing if it ever warms up. This is the Pacific tree frog. We don't have the parasite here, yay, but the parasite is renowned for causing what are called these deformities or malformations. Some of you might have heard about these. When you see something that looks like that, where there's 3 legs, where there should be 1, you wonder, there's got to be human related to mutations, right? Some environmental contaminant is causing these mutations and these multiple limbs when there should only be 2. Yeah, would you agree? Well, no, it's parasite. It is a trematode. It is a fluke parasite by the name of Riboria. You don't have to worry about the names, but I think you'll see that, wow, another fascinating case of a parasite. And already you're thinking, how does it get in? And why is it doing that to the frog? And there's where all kinds of fascinating stories that I just want to show you just a little bit about. First of all, this is a special technique that people use. People weren't sure. They thought it has to be deformities caused by some human contaminant. But if you look at the developing limb bud of this frog in this special technique, you'll see these little black spots. Those little black spots are larvae that look like this. They're the parasite flatworm, what we call a metacercaria, an encysted stage. Yeah, and so if you have a bunch of these around the developing limb buds of the tadpoles, you can end up with these multiple appendages where there should be 1. Look at, oh wait, there's 2 femurs here, multiple hind limbs. Yeah. Wow, and right away you're saying, larva. Any guesses? So it's a larval fluke. What does that teach us? I would tell my students it's like a little crystal ball. You kind of can predict the future of where that parasite wants to end up. Yeah. Bring it on. That's the larval trematode. What do you think the life cycle might be? Into a bird, into a fish. Into a bird. And so you can see there's the poor frog with its multiple appendages. It's neither going to be a good swimmer or a good hopper with those extra appendages, more vulnerable to predation by specific, I can use that word now, the specific vertebrate host, a blue heron. Yeah, so I'm teaching you to be thinking about these complex life cycles. That poor frog got infected by the developing limb buds of these little larval stages released from snails. 3-host life cycle, not 4 like my previous one. In this case, it's 3. The heron, always the snail, and the tadpole and the frog. Yeah, and so think about that again, how important that's going to be for my bullets coming up about why parasites are superstars. Yeah, so not only are they causing mortality to the frog, but to be present, look what has to be present in that ecosystem. Healthy population of snails, at least frequent visitation by herons. And it's the kind of fun part of being a parasite person, because by the presence of a parasite, you know a lot about the ecology of the system you're working in. So a couple just oh my facts that you have in your mind is I've given you a couple examples. I gave you that tapeworm with the great big tapeworms in the sticklebats. And what that says on the top is parasites and complex life cycles. But if I made my point here, to get in to a host, one fundamental adaptation is that many parasites live in the food web. They exploit the prey of the predator that you want to get in. Check. And I guess that's one way I want you to remember it, is that no food web you can think of is devoid of parasites. They're getting themselves into these food web relationships. And can you think of a better way in to exploit your host prey? Whether you're a frog, whether you're a human, whatever, it's a pretty good way to get, if you're thinking like a parasite, back in again. Fascinating? Everybody's good? Okay, because it gets better. Because, not that that wasn't good, but you get the idea. Wouldn't it be like boggle your mind? People always say Tim, what made you go for a career in parasitology? Coming up right here. I just found it so unbelievably fascinating that can you modify the prey's behavior or appearance to increase the likelihood of predation by the right host? Now, would that boggle your mind? Say it again. Can you increase the possibility of that prey being eaten by the predator to increase your transmission success? Now, that would be mind-boggling. When I heard it at the time, I thought, no way. And this idea, I think I've convinced you of, based on that, what I've just mentioned, is that no wonder parasites are these vital indicators of complex food webs. You don't see them doing their thing inside a host, but they do. Yeah. And this is a statement I often mention. Before my talk, I said, do you think a healthy has fewer parasites or lots of parasites? And now you know what the answer is. A healthy ecosystem is one with lots of parasites because you have to have all these intact food webs. Yeah. So the more intact your food webs are, the more likely your parasites are being transmitted like crazy, and you have a healthy ecosystem. So you can use parasites as indicators of the state of ecosystem health. And I bet you didn't know that. Yeah. And so hopefully I made my point. And so this idea of flukes being renowned for modifying behavior of the intermediate hosts in spectacular ways is really known in the flukes. In all parasite groups it occurs, but we know a great deal about it within the flukes, and they're two of my favorite examples coming up. Everybody gets the concept. You saw these life cycles. Can you modify the prey to make it more likely to get into the specific definitive host? And basically what you want to try to do is somehow make that intermediate host, the frog, the stickleback, a snail maybe, to predation by that specific host. Check. So remember this example. What? They have a striped set of bags. They have a trematode. That trematode wants to, as I mentioned, get into some type of terrestrial songbird, usually flycatchers of some type. This particular parasite isn't on the island, but it's in Alberta. It's all over the place, just doesn't happen to be on the island because the right snail's not here. But you get the idea. If I convince you by the photograph that the appearance of the snail has been modified. Well, as we're going to see, thank you, Attenborough, not only has the appearance been modified, but I want your quiz. How is the behavior modified to increase the likelihood that that snail is going to be eaten by the right bird? Check. When I heard about this from my prof way back when, I thought, why? Because in Manitoba, you got to see it. You can go out, catch the snail, and there they are. Not only, by the way, as we'll see, because you don't believe me now, not only do they have these striped bags that resemble caterpillars, but they pulsate. Basically acting as a beacon, come hither, eat me, is what they're saying. And so you get the idea why I would find them interesting. And of course, the greatest naturalist of our time took take note of it. But I might need you, Emily, to turn the sound on, or
a morning in summer. There's been a shower of rain. The meadows and woodlands are drenched. Snails are slowly crawling around through the wet leaves, grazing. They're feeding on algae and rotting vegetable matter of one kind and another. Early morning is the best time for them. The sun is not yet hot enough to dry them out, and they can explore parts of the vegetation they can't reach at other times. This one is different from the others.
Okay.
Its left tentacle is swollen and pulsating. It has a parasite. A few months ago, the snail took in, along with its normal food, some bird droppings. Within them were the tiny eggs of a fluke that was living within the bird's gut. Those hatched and the parasite developed enormously, taking over much of the snail's body. As the sun shines brighter, the parasite extends a striped muscular bag packed with tiny larvae into the snail's tentacle. If it has the choice, it nearly always picks the left one. Birds rarely eat whole snails, they're far too big, and few can extract them from their shells. Nonetheless, the larvae must reach the body of another bird to develop further. For some reason, the presence of the parasite changes the snail's behavior. As the day wears on, it does not, like uninfected snails, fall back into the cool undergrowth out of harm's way. Instead, it remains exposed out in the open, dangerously so. Now, there is a parasite in each tentacle. Perhaps they look like caterpillars or tasty worms. Maybe they just look odd, but certainly the flycatcher finds them interesting. The connection has been made. The circle is complete. Another bird has become infected. Inside the bird, the striped bag releases its multitudes of larvae. They soon move through the bird's body and take up residence in its gut. The whole cycle starts all over again.
Wow.
Well, yeah.
Thank you, thank you.
And
We'll get that one at the end. Believe it or not, the snail survives. Ready to produce more larvae. Just, you think that one was cool? Another really famous one, probably the world's most famous one. And how many other parasites or anything can you ever hear the expression slime balls and zombie ants? The parasite is a liver fluke, tiny liver fluke, that lives in a variety of different herbivores, such as sheep. It also lives in cattle, as you can see, and elk. My brother spends his life and left several of his graduate students studying this particular fluke, and we learn so much more about it because of his lab in Lethbridge. But I wanted to teach you just a little bit more about the world of parasites, because how it gets into this herbivore is one of the most fascinating aspects of being a parasite. First, it is terrestrial, just like the fluke beforehand. How do you work in a terrestrial environment when usually the larva is swimming and gets into aquatic hosts out of an aquatic snail? Well, you live in a terrestrial snail host. And where my brother does his work is in the Cypress Hills of Alberta. And they know all about the snail part of the life cycle. Well, here's where the slime ball part comes in. It turns out that when you're infected with this particular parasite, the larval stage leaves the snail in what are called mucus balls or slime balls. So they prevent desiccation of those cercaria, and they have the right chemistry to be able to attract the next host in the life cycle. Ants. And so the ants that you have on the island are the hosts. Those ones of the great big colonies, the formicid ants, as they're called. And so the larval stages develop within the abdomen of ants. And those of you who listen carefully will ask the question then, well, sheep don't eat ants, elk don't eat ants, cattle don't eat ants. How do you finish the life cycle? How do you complete the life cycle? you get this part, all snails use snails. Here's a fundamental adaptation in a terrestrial environment to get into the next host, get in, remember? And it's exuding mucus balls with the larvae that are found delectable to ants that then take them back to their colony to feed the babies, and more ants get infected. The zombie ant part of things you can guess. Modify the behavior of the ant to increase the likelihood or vulnerability to predation by the herbivore. Yeah. The reason my brother gets a lot of money to study this particular parasite is it's an invasive species. It's not supposed to be in the Cypress Hills. And it lives happily in elk and the deer species there, mule deer, but it doesn't live happily in cattle. And if you know anything about Alberta and cattle, you know that money would come your way because it can actually kill. Heavily infected cattle can die. He also does his work on Salt Spring Island. What's Salt Spring famous for? The lamb. Yeah. And guess what? Heavy infections of this invasive species of fluke can cause problems in the lamb. So that's where he does a lot of his work on the life cycle and etc. And so I want you to be thinking about that. Just a couple of slides about this one guy. That's what it looks like. Cam coined the expression, that's my brother Cam, he coined the expression clingers. They cling to vegetation. Uninfected ants don't do that. If you're infected with this parasite, this trematode, you cling. And don't forget the larva of the fluke encyst in that body cavity. We've shown you that. But what happens is so bizarre. One larva does not encyst in the body cavity, but instead migrates to the ant's brain. And while in that brain, it triggers a most remarkable behavioral change. It causes that. Infected ants climb up vegetation and cling to either grass blades or flowers. And then, of course, they're available. These clinging ants, these clingers, Klingons, they're also called. And you can imagine what plants are involved and all that stuff is a site of lots of research, but you get the idea. Yeah. And basically you can think of it as parasite mediated or induced lockjaw. The mechanism of how they're getting through this life cycle of a species, a mammal that doesn't normally eat ants, is triggering a behavioral change. Wow. Okay, so another wow factor, if there ever was one. And of course, you get the idea why they would do that. They're increasing their vulnerability to the specific herbivore that you want to get in. Yeah. And this is what it looks like. This is one of Cam's photos. You know now that that's not normal. They spend a good chunk of their day clinging, not feeding, not going back to their nest, but actually clinging, in this case, to clover. And you know that in the brain is a larval trematode, and in their abdomen are all these larvae waiting to be transmitted. Talk about complex, talk about cool. All kinds of research is devoted to it, especially because if cattle are coming around and eating these heavily infected ants, they can suffer consequence. And so again, the disease component comes back into it. You guys ready? Dana Graham, Liz, Cootie are not allowed to stay. This parasite's right out here. In fact, it's going to be right out here even more, so very soon. So here's the hint. This is a larva. Okay, what you're looking at here is a herring. So here is a marine parasite. I was showing you this at the beginning. You were like, Tim, I haven't got a clue. What are you talking about? But now my students would know, they would guess if that's a larva. And here's the adult round worm. You would ask the question, what is it doing to get out? And thinks it's a larva. And how did it get infected in the first place? How did the parasite get in? Let's start off easier. How does it get in? What would be your prediction as to how that nematode got so to heavily infect that poor Pacific herring? It probably ate something. Right? It probably ate something to get so many, maybe a whole bunch of things to be able to get infected. Yeah. So watch for in my life cycle coming up. And then the next thing, the crystal ball part of things is, where does it want to go? The larva. So it's going to get in by diet. It's going to get out by diet. There's a hint. What's the next host in the life cycle? Something's going to eat that to finish the life cycle, so they end up like that in the small intestine of something. A bird is one good try, and there's other relatives too. A marine mammal, right? A marine mammal that eats fish, and here's the answer. It wasn't a very hard quiz, really. But there is the answer, and it's of food webs. So they can live in the baleen filter feeding whales by ingesting krill. But notice, krill are always involved. And other types of micro shrimpy guys, but krill are the big ones. So everybody's got that. The nematodes that are coursing through our waters in our hosts right now all go through that incredibly abundant resource krill. And if you happen to go into a plankton feeding whale, you can go directly. Yeah. So gray whales, humpbacks, etc. The more likely one around here, herring and squid. So herring and squid eat the krill. They stay within the herring until when? They're ingested by some type of fish-eating mammal. Most important hosts around here, we think. We don't get, as Graham will tell you, we don't get too many samples to be able to look at, but certainly the sea lions, the harbor seals, Pacific white-sided dolphins, orca, have all been shown for that one parasite. So what you're looking at here, if I've made my point, parasites have embedded themselves in their host food web, and this is the best example I could ever give you, especially as it is a local example. And anybody who's done any fishing here, whether it's salmon, lingcod, rockfish, here's where you are in the life cycle. And so you can imagine the potential for the larva going from fish to fish, from herring and smaller fish to larger fish. And so I've had rockfish with thousands of this worm. Yeah, lingcod too. And many of you have seen it, maybe if you've opened up your fillets, and what is that? You don't want to eat them. They can get into humans as well. But you get the idea of out there in nature, what a complex food web. And parasites are there, even though they're invisible to you. And so no wonder I would say and remind my students of Holy Complexity Batman, but it's a really good example of when you guys are seeing the herring spawning, you might get lucky pretty soon, any day now. You're going to be thinking about the parasite. Promise? Don't just think about the herring, think about the life cycle of a parasite that's happening out there all the time. And I think that's one of the fascinating aspects of being a parasitologist. And now you guys listen to a little bit about it. So have I convinced you? They're complex and they're fascinating. Have I convinced you that? Do I need to remind you? What are some of the bullets that follow? There's my quiz. Why would you now consider them as being superstars? They can be involved as disease agents and regulate host populations out there in wildlife and fish, etc. Yeah, so that's one part, the bad part, if you will. This is a big one that you guys better never forget. They're indicators of food web interactions in nature, healthy ecosystems with lots of parasites. And hopefully one of the most fascinating other aspects to get them through their host food web is to manipulate behavior and morphology. We have the zombie snail as an example. We have the zombie ants as another example. Just before I leave you, when Jane or I was academic types, as in other walks of life, you have your heroes. And two of my heroes are shown here. One of them is this guy, William Campbell. I actually know him personally. Why I mention him to you now is that, did you know that there's a parasitologist that won the Nobel Prize in 2015? And so I'm very proud, as the rest of our American Society of Parasitologists are, to have a Nobel laureate as part of our society. And just as an overview, but what did he do that was so famous to get him the Nobel Prize in medicine was that he and two Japanese colleagues were the ones that identified the wonder drug ivermectin. And you guys might not know of ivermectin, but you kind of should, and that's why I'm stressing it, is that it is the drug that's often used in control of nematode diseases, whether it's human or veterinary. So the drug that you take for your horses to get rid of nematodes is ivermectin. The drug that we take to get rid of heartworm in dogs, ivermectin. And some of the wicked human diseases that are the nasties out there, ivermectin. So he was the one that in his earlier life developed that wonder drug, ivermectin. So William Campbell is one name I want to leave you with. The more familiar one to everybody would be this wonderful guy, who is our former president. And you may have heard that he's not doing well. He's in hospice at home. But why is he famous? Why every year of my career at VIU could I mention his name in my parasitology class? Not many people would know this one. And so I want to stress it to my students that Jimmy Carter is so famous, not just for being president. In fact, he's more famous after he became president for what he did and does. You would know that he's the leader of the Carter Foundation, the Rosalind and Jimmy Carter Foundation. And you would also know Habitat for Humanity. So he's done a bunch, but what's he done for parasitology? Back in the day, this would have been in the 80s and 90s, he said, what can I do to prevent disease for the poorest of the poor? For diseases that are neglected by humans because they're over there, they're in Africa, and we tend to ignore them because they don't cause problems to North Americans. Well, he wanted to do something about it. And the Jimmy Carter Foundation is incredibly famous for doing just that, putting money towards neglected parasitic diseases. One of them in particular is this nasty, would everybody agree that that's the nastiest parasite you've ever seen? It's called the guinea worm. Children are most at risk. It's a clever parasite. It's still cool, but it's nasty in what it does. It causes these blisters, and the animal gets to be 0.5 meter, 2 feet. That's the female. And right away, Jimmy Carter would say, what? It only afflicts the poorest of the poor in terms of the villages in Africa. What can I do to do what needs to be done and eradicate parasite disease? And I wouldn't be mentioning it if Jimmy Carter wasn't incredibly successful. And what he said was, in my lifetime, and it's nearing its end, sadly, I want to eradicate at least one parasitic disease. And this is the one he chose, the guinea worm. And you can see why. It doesn't kill its host, but it's an incredible irritation. It's an incredible afflicts your daily lives in ways that are beyond imagining. And right away, what could he do about it? By the way, this is the ancient custom of how they have to remove it. Basically on a matchstick or a type of stick, because if you break it, the worm can cause all kinds of other problems. So you have to unravel it slowly out of these blister-like structures. So right away, how would you start? You know, he picked a parasite where there was a fragile link in the life cycle. Yeah, something that, you know, it's hard to work with vectors like mosquitoes and things. So, but this one had a life cycle where if you could improve the drinking water or do something to help with the drinking water, because here's the life cycle. Here's the worm spreading its babies to get into a little copepod. if you could break that. You think, well, that's easy. I mean, look, when we drink, we don't need to worry about drinking copepods, but don't forget where you are. The poorest of the poor that do not have drinking water like we're so used to. The only water is there. So yes, they can improve the drinking water, but they really have to get that link. And that's where, see, they're drinking the contaminated water with these infected copepods. And so this is what Jimmy Carter and his foundation did. Lots and lots of education, lots of buy-in from the local communities. What's the bottom line? Where is it? In his lifetime, remember, he wanted to eradicate a parasite. You know, eradicating an animal is that's not good. But I'd like to convince you why it would be good in this case. It is a nasty, nasty worm. Even I'm disgusted by this one. I'm amazed at the cleverness of the life cycle, but I'm also disgusted by the fact that people are affected by it. So there's Jimmy. He doesn't just do over his life, he doesn't do it from his office in Atlanta. He goes there. So this is why he's one of my heroes. He's incredible for what he was able to do. And you see this? I've got one. Many people know about it now because in Jimmy Carter, we can thank for this. It's called a life straw. You can suck up water, and if it happens to have any parasites in water, you get prevented from drinking it. So yes, it's been taken to North America now, but there it is. And of course, every kid who's out there drinking the potential water, and who would drink out of that? But again, if it's your only drinking water, you can see where the eradication effort was spent. Simple, doesn't work for vectors and things like that, but also it works. And so you're all asking, you know, Jimmy Carter is now 98 years old, not doing so well as we know. How close are we? My only graph. Imagine almost 1 million people affected in 1990. 1 million kids for the most part. And so this is why I could go, imagine how fun it would be for my students to say, okay, how successful has Jimmy Carter been and his foundation? And every year, because I've been there a long time, you can actually say where the numbers are. And again, there's not many parasitic diseases where you can do that all the way to individual numbers, like 10,040. So it's pretty amazing that the buy-in of the local communities has contributed to that data. And in 2017, the last graph that I could get, 30 cases. Today, 4. And close. So we got to hope for a little bit more for Jimmy Carter to be able to say, yes, I did it. But part of the problem why there's still that lingering one is that some countries are really suffering from civil strife and war. And it's hard for, you know, the Carter Foundation folks to get in there to really monitor. But for now, we're close. And that's what I want to tell you about. So Jimmy Carter, William Campbell, and what I want to leave you with is that parasites are cool. Guys, I'd like to take a look at this. I've actually used these on long distance bike trips where you run out of water and you pull out the stream right there. Don't want to drink out of it. Well, you know you don't because of beaver fever and other parasites, but this gives you a lot of safety to be able to drink out of the streams and lakes. So I'm sure you guys, some of you are hikers, you've already seen them. So you see there's a little cloth filter in there. And it's basically identical to what Carter provided. And again, the key is for the Carter's Foundation to work like that is these would be free to the villagers. You can't charge them for it. They would just have them around their neck. And whenever they're out there playing or whatever, they would the filter need there, not so much as it's really there, they're just copepods. Here, Giardia and smaller protozoans, you would do it more often. So I would probably change the, I would say new one. I just go get a new one, they're only $20 or something. Yeah. Yeah.
Would there be guinea worms in Canada?
Like of that type?
Well, I'm just thinking of places that have contaminated water.
Not so much. Our public health standards are so much more strict that no, there's nothing to really worry about. There's a couple protozoans that small guys that might be a bit of a problem in some, but not.
Well, virus is considered a type of.
Sort of, but that's a whole other, because they're so much more complex in terms of what they inside a cell and stuff. It's a different field we call virology. So it's kind of a subset, but they still need a host. So they're that part of the parasite, if you will, but so there's virology, there's microbiology, and there's parasitology. And the journals of each would be into separate journals because they're different. Yeah.
So it's smaller, getting up to larger and larger, say like to seals and whales, I guess they can live for years and years. With all
Yeah,
these parasites,
yeah.
whereas smaller things might not last a season.
Exactly. And so you've got to have a fundamental point. The other aspect of why they have these complex life cycles is just that. They can, if you're an egg, you can have a bit of time, but if you can get yourself into a fish, not only moving a lot farther, and you get yourself into a mammal, you can cross, ocean seas. So at first that paradox seems like a real pain to go through these really complex life cycles, but you can see what they do. Modify behavior, and imagine that rockfish that accumulates a whole bunch. So Graham, you've looked at sea lions every once in a while, or seals, aren't they loaded with these worms? Now you know why. This takes a few predation events, and then it's basically an instant population.
Any parasites that live off other.
I just talked about that in the guest lecture just the other day. Yes, they're called hyper parasites. And we've just now opened our eyes to it because it's tiny. But yes, there are parasites and parasites. And guess what? The more we understand about life's biodiversity, guess where a lot of life's biodiversity is? And we've ignored hyper parasites. Yeah, there are quite a few different types of hyperparasites.
Is there plant parasites?
Yes, there's lots of plant parasites. We don't talk about them in our parasitology class because it's more of the agricultural and tree part of things, but yes, there are plant parasites. There's lots of lice that live on plants, ectoparasites, yeah, and there's lots of viruses and bacteria and nematodes that live on plants. And plants, you know of a parasitic plant yourself? Mistletoe.
No.
So there's examples of parasitic plants as well as parasites of plants.
I was trying to see the different ways the parasites get out from
Yeah.
our presentation.
So the
Main-
most,
Excrement or death, then that the
Yep.
worm there was actually.
well, that one's, as disgusting as that parasite is, the way out is amazing. Because it has to go into water, right? So here you are, a terrestrial mammal, a human, and it has to get out and into water. And guess what? It does so by making this blister. And the blister gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And that is how the female worm. And she just puts the tail into her uterus out, and that lets the babies out, and he comes back in again. So nasty, but cool. Like, it's got a very unusual way out, because living in the skin, how are you gonna have fecal pass in your feces? You can't.
But the reason the person goes in the water is.
Yeah, that's what you would do, right? If you have this nasty, it's heat and lots of immune stuff going on, is to cool it off. And it's one of the ways that the Carter Foundation really thought about, if you happen to be infected, your child say, don't go near the water. Right? That'd be a way of preventing, another way of preventing infection. You're trying to get at both ends. Yeah.
How do you explain a parasite kills its host?
Not very good for a parasite to do that. And so, excellent. And so no parasite kills its host unless it's heavily infected.
Is that even true for malaria?
Yep. Yeah, in a vast majority of cases. Why is malaria so bad? Because so many of our red blood cells have been taken over. Why is Giardia so bad? It's because basically all of our intestinal cells have been taken over by the parasite.
So it doesn't intend to kill the host?
No. And those that do kill their host, don't do so before the parasite has undergone their full development. So there's some insects that kill their host, we call them parasitoids. They always kill their caterpillar host.
It doesn't make any sense to kill.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense at first unless you undergone all your development and you become the next stage of that insect and fly away and infect. Yeah.
Emily, are there any questions on chat?
No.
I can't read from here.
No chat questions.
I have one more question about malaria. My father got malaria in northern Africa. And I think they gave him quinine in those days, right?
Yeah.
So, and then he took up drinking gin and tonic, of course, over the years.
You would need a lot of that to make it work, but yeah.
My question is though, is the parasite able to adapt itself to put up with the quinine?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, because
A derivative of quinine is chloroquine,
right,
and chloroquine was supposed to be this wonder drug that was going to get rid of the scourge of malaria worldwide. And what happened?
Yeah.
The parasite adapted to that new chemistry, and sadly, it's now there's many. If you go to Africa now, you take a cocktail of drugs because of the resistance to the parasite. Yeah. Which makes that guinea worm even more fascinating to me, anyways, because it'll be the first. It's not my fact. First parasitic, first disease that's not being the result of that being controlled not by a drug or a vaccine. And the only other one is smallpox. So here's one where they've taken advantage of a very fragile link in the life cycle. Humans eating a copepod. That's kind of rare, but in situations of the poorest of the poor, it's not so rare. So the other thing I didn't mention here, another way is to improve the drinking water. Like, don't have that stagnant water sitting there. That's good for the copepods. Improve the drinking water where you can. You know, the poorest of the poor villages, I mean, far away, for example, they can't do that. But you get the idea. Yeah.
Jim, with Anisakis, I understand how it gets into the herring from the faucets, but then you also find it in halibut. So
Yeah.
how is it going from that coil spring and cystic in the liver in the herring to the same?
I've seen halibut that are just so loaded, it's because they've eaten the herring.
Yeah, but how, I'm
Oh.
imagining that gets digested.
Yes, so they're now in the herring stomach. I mean, that's a halibut stomach,
Yeah.
and they have a way of basically getting into the flesh. They have
And
the
then
migraine
interesting.
Yeah. in the back of the liver again. So they're amazing to get into all. If you add up the number of food web links for Anisakis, it can be, whale, krill, and then about 4 different types of fish.
Okay.
But carnivorous fish, yeah, they keep on moving up the cliff. Yeah, and if we get them, by eating poorly cooked fish or whatever, then parasite doesn't know where it is, and it starts migrating the same way, and that's where it can cause problems.
So if you're eating raw fish, which a lot of people do, and I
Yeah.
don't think I'll ever do it again.
But the vast majority of people eat raw fish that's been previously frozen. And then you kill the parasite. Not always, well, and you're at risk. Yeah. Yeah.
I wondered about the herons, when they become the host. Are they killed raw? Do they die?
No, they don't. They don't cause any problems. Just transfer it on. There's lots and lots of eggs. Now you know why they produce them. Getting through their life cycle is not easy. Yeah.
They must have an evolutionary history. Which
Yep.
would be very, very hard to trace, I suppose. And what drives their evolutionary changes? Is it the hyperparasite that competes with parasites?
Yeah, the parasite that, like, give me one of the examples, like in the,
Why does a particular parasite evolve? What drives its evolution success? And what does it compete with?
so not only is it compete, so if you're an intestinal parasite, for example, you're not only competing with other parasites that are in there. So people ask, well, why are they adapted to certain sites within their host? And one of the reasons is an evolutionary reason, because it's kind of like a, Dana and I refer to it as the ghost of competition past. There's already somebody there. And they need to move somewhere else, otherwise they won't be successful. So one of them is competition with other parasites.
And do the hyperparasites also drive that evolution?
Hyperparasites are more associated with ectoparasites, because it's hard to imagine a hyperparasite getting on a tapeworm, for example.
They're pretty clever, according to.
Yeah, well, one day maybe they will, but where we know the world of hyperparasites is when you're a hyperparasite of an insect. That happens to be a parasite. So think of my honeybee. If there was a parasite on the mite, that would be a hyperparasite. And they exist. Mhm.
Where does your cat get a tape? Because we had a cat that was always getting tapeworm.
Yeah,
Where do they, like, we could eat?
you have an
fish.
outdoor, you have an outdoor cat.
Oh, it was.
Yeah,
Yes, where do they get
yeah.
their
There's,
tapeworm?
there's a few different ways, but the most likely way was it a big?
The tape?
Yeah.
Tapeworms? No, but like long and thin and,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
you just, yeah.
So that one is ingested by a very cool predation pathway. They groom and they eat their fleas.
Oh,
So it's an accidental ingestion of fleas during a behavior of grooming. It's not a cool way of getting in.
oh,
Yeah. But you don't see it as much nowadays because of flea medicines.
right,
And flea medicine control the fleas, which
Right.
control how many tapeworms are getting up.
oh,
But there's other tapeworms besides that one. That's why I have to do the little guy or big guy.
no, just this thin, flat,
Yeah, one also often indicates why are you releasing yourself all of a sudden? It's because there's many of them in there.
right?
So that's not good.
Yeah, but
When she mentioned
got to be
cats,
twin.
I was thinking toxoplasmosis. And
Yeah, that's another very famous one. How many women out there were warned about the litter box? And were, yeah. And the other thing about toxoplasmosis, it's in sea lice. Oh, shit, too.
Yeah, that's a question about the bees. If the existence of these parasites is sort of an indicator of healthy ecosystem. That doesn't seem to quite mesh.
I need to look up something with that particular parasite. The reason why it's so notoriously bad is because humans keep on moving honeybees. We used to be certified on Vancouver Island to be mite-free. And now we no longer are because people brought over honeybee colonies and now all our bee colonies are infested. If you're not a if you're a beekeeper, you have to treat for the varroa mite. And if you don't, your colony will die. So you do chemicals and things, but even that's an issue because you try to sell the honey and you don't want, you know, the mite strips to infect the honey. So it's very complicated. And what a lot of people don't do is they don't treat for the mite anymore. And of course, then the populations increase. And it's a big problem.
I did see somewhere just in the news the other day that they actually had a vaccine.
Yes.
They were developing
Yeah,
for bees.
yeah, and it's a vaccine against the mite.
Yeah,
Yeah.
how would you, or do you know how you would actually administer a vaccine to honeybees?
Well, the beauty of a honeybee colony is you can administer it to one individual in the colony. So stay clean. And the infection, the virus or whatever, the antibiotic in this case will take, go to every member of the hive.
makes the needle.
It's in their diet. You feed them special diet. If I'm thinking about the one, which it is, yeah. So yeah, it's not easy, but it's an introduced mite. I'm supposed to be here, and so it's on the other side, North Europe. And in Europe, it's not a big problem because bees have what's called hygienic behavior. The bees that are in the hive have this hygienic behavior to remove diseased brood. And if you remove the diseased brood, your colony will not be as heavily infected. Our bees don't have that behavior. So another way of controlling it besides vaccines is genetically modify the bees so they evolve this genetic behavior. So that's another enticing way, because as we know with insects on crops and things, chemicals don't work. In the case of malaria and drugs, they don't work over time. So if we can develop their genetic resistance to it by pathways like that, that'd be good.
The one advantage you've stressed for parasites is they indicate a healthy system, but we tend to classify other species as having a contribution to the ecology. What is the other contribution to parasites?
Of parasites? One thing I like doing is if I was taking you guys on a field trip, we'd go to a pond or we'd find a little stickleback what if I told you this stickleback had well over 20 different species in a healthy ecosystem? And it would have about 2 if that ecosystem had acid rain or heavy metals or some pollutant affecting it. And so not only are they indicators of healthy food webs, why do you have 20 species? Because the trematodes and tapeworms and nematodes are all in there, going through these complex life cycles often. Yeah,
So they're actually accelerating evolution.
yeah, it's basically accelerating these food webs and the possibilities of what are the chances of in that ecosystem, the parasite going extinct if you're in so many hosts. Not very, like if you're in all the different hosts out there, even if your bird doesn't come back that next summer, you're still there waiting for that bird. So we don't tend to think like that. And another old my fact that is just, it's a big, huge field now. It's called environmental parasitology. Can parasites actually be used as biological tags? And obviously, I'm telling you about it, they can. In other words, if you looked at the parasites, say cestodes, within our intestine, and you measured heavy metals, they're far more sensitive as heavy metal indicators than free living invertebrates, free living animals. In fact, orders of magnitude. So what people now do is go and check the parasites out in the far north to see what heavy metals might be cycling through, or oils, or organics, or whatever. Because, and you can imagine why, if the parasite's living in your intestine, sucking all kinds of nutrients, and maybe this heavy metal as well. So people have measured like the liver and the spleen of a fish, and then compare that to the actual parasite. The parasite gets more. So don't sample the liver, sample the parasite, and you'd have a better way of monitoring the health of that ecosystem. I have a buddy that works with acid rain in St. Lawrence area, and another that works on another type of parasite in fish in England for that very phenomenon, where they're very concerned about heavy metal contamination. The oil sands, another really good example.
Anyone else?
Yeah, geez, guys, we've been going. Yeah.
So thank you so much, Tim. That was really interesting.